In the 1950s, if you went to a highly respected medical clinic in Montreal, just seeking help for something like postpartum depression,
Right.
you might have woken up months later with 26 years of your memory completely erased.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you wouldn't know your own name, you wouldn't recognize your children, and you'd have absolutely no idea that the treatment that destroyed your mind was secretly funded by the CIA.
That is just, it's terrifying.
It really is. So today, for you listening and studying with us, we're looking at the foundations of abnormal psychology to ask a really uncomfortable question. Who actually gets to decide what is, quote unquote, crazy?
Right.
And what happens when the people defining the cure are vastly more dangerous than the disease? Welcome to the Psychology Undergrad.
It is a phenomenal question to kick things off.
Yeah.
Because when you strip away the clinical terminology, the history of abnormal psychology isn't just a history of medicine.
No, definitely not.
It is a history of power. It's a record of how society's moral compass and whoever happens to hold the religious or scientific authority at the time dictates the line between sanity and madness.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. We are looking at our Chapter 1 sources today, and the through line is just impossible to ignore. Whether we're talking about ancient demonic exorcisms or Cold War brainwashing, or even the massive wait lists in the modern Canadian mental health system,
Yeah.
the definition of abnormal is really just a mirror reflecting whatever society values or frankly fears in that specific era.
Which brings us to the foundational problem, right?
Mm.
How do we even define abnormal right now? If you look at the current literature, there is no single bulletproof definition.
Yep.
Instead, the field relies on this kind of fragile consensus of 5 different criteria.
Right, the 5 criteria. And since we are parsing through some dense material here, I was trying to find a common way of thinking to lock this into memory for the test.
Oh, I love good mnemonic.
Right. So the letters are S, V, P, D, U. So I'm using the mnemonic. Some vampires prefer dark umbrellas.
Okay, some vampires prefer dark umbrellas.
I like it.
Yeah. So that stands for statistical infrequency, violation of norms, personal suffering, disability, and unexpectedness.
It works perfectly. But let's elevate that past the textbook definitions, because each of those criteria actually has a massive philosophical blind spot if you just use it on its own.
We'll take the first one, right? Statistical infrequency. The idea is that if a behavior is rare, it's abnormal.
Yeah.
But that logic falls apart immediately. Because having an IQ of 160 is statistically infrequent, being an Olympic-level sprinter is statistically infrequent. We don't pathologize those traits. We actually celebrate them.
Precisely. Which forces clinicians to rely on the V violation of norms. You know, does the behavior make the people around them anxious? Does it break the social contract?
Right.
But frankly, this is where the diagnostic criteria get dangerously subjective.
This is exactly where I push back on this standard clinical framework. Because, if I lived in ancient Rome, the absolute social norm was gathering in a coliseum to watch human beings fight to the death for entertainment. Yeah, that was just a normal Tuesday.
Exactly. But today, we would consider someone who enjoys that to be deeply psychopathic. Doesn't the violation of norms criterion essentially admit that abnormal is entirely relative?
Yeah.
It's just whatever the current moral majority says it is.
What's fascinating here is that is the exact tension the field wrestles with. Violation of norms explicitly makes abnormality a relative concept. And we just have to be honest about that.
Right.
It's why you cannot diagnose someone based on one letter of your mnemonic. If violating norms was the only metric, every political dissident or civil rights leader in history could be classified as mentally ill by the state.
Which is where the internal experience comes in. The P, personal suffering.
Yeah.
The behavior has to create internal distress, like the torment of severe depression.
Right.
But even that isn't universal, because a classic psychopath might continuously violate social norms and feel absolutely zero personal distress about it. They might actually feel great.
Right, so you have to bring in the disability or dysfunction.
Yeah.
Does the behavior impair your life? Can you hold a job? Can you maintain a relationship?
Yeah, the practical stuff.
Exactly. And finally, the U, unexpectedness. Is this distress a disproportionate response to environmental stressor? Like if you are a billionaire and you're having daily panic attacks about starving to death, That is an unexpected response.
So, some vampires prefer dark umbrellas. You really need a constellation of these factors.
You do.
But what fascinates me is how humans historically explained these behaviors before we had any concept of neurology or neurotransmitters.
Oh, the history is wild.
It really is. Because when early humans witnessed someone hallucinating or experiencing profound, unexpected distress, they didn't see a medical issue. They saw a spiritual battlefield.
Because without scientific literacy, human understanding just defaults to the supernatural.
Always.
If you can't explain the mechanism of a disease, you attribute it to a malicious agency. This is the era of demonology. Records from early Chinese, Egyptian, Babylonian, and Greek cultures all point to this belief that a demon or spirit could physically occupy a human body and just control the mind.
And their treatment protocols were horrific. Exorcisms, forced starvation, and trepanning.
Yeah, trepanning.
There are skulls dating back to the Stone Age, including some Aboriginal specimens found right here in British Columbia, where a hole was chipped or drilled completely through the skull of a living person.
While they were alive.
Yes. The leading theory is that this was an attempt to create an exit route for the evil spirits, literally trying to let the bad vibes out of the cranium.
I should note there is some debate there. Some researchers suggest trepanning might have been a crude surgery to relieve intracranial pressure from, war club injuries.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, but regardless of the specific intent of the drilling, the overarching paradigm at the time was absolute. Mental illness was a spiritual failing.
Right. Until Hippocrates in the 5th century BC.
Yes. Hippocrates is crucial here, not because his medical theories were correct, because they absolutely weren't, but because of the philosophical shift he initiated.
Right. He argued that mental illnesses were not punishments from the gods. He insisted they had natural physical causes.
This is somatogenesis, the idea that the soma, the physical body, is what breaks the mind. He thought it was an imbalance of 4 humors, right? Blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm.
Which sounds so gross today.
It does. Too much black bile meant you were melancholic. Obviously, the biology is entirely wrong, but the mechanism he proposed was revolutionary. He essentially told society, stop looking at the sky for answers and start looking at the body.
But that intellectual leap didn't last, right? With the collapse of the Greco-Roman civilization, the medical locus of control just evaporated. We entered the Dark Ages, and society's framework for understanding human behavior swung violently back to religion.
And this is where the intersection of authority, morality, and fear gets incredibly dark. By the 13th century, Europe is totally destabilized by plagues and famines.
Right, people are terrified.
Exactly. And when society is terrified, it looks for a scapegoat. The church declares that witchcraft is real and instigated by Satan. And in 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issues a papal bull that effectively launches a massive, legally sanctioned witch hunt.
And then 2 monks subsequently write a manual called the Malleus Maleficarum, the Witch's Hammer.
Yes.
It wasn't just the book, it was the institutionalization of paranoia. It explicitly codified that a sudden loss of reason, what we now recognize as severe mental illness, was undeniable evidence of demonic possession.
The moral irony here is staggering. To, quote-unquote, save these people's souls, the authorities subjected them to torture.
The dunking tests, for example.
Yeah, talk about a lose-lose situation.
Literally. They would bind a woman and throw her into a river. If she drowned, well, she was innocent. If she floated, it meant she was rejecting the pure water of baptism, so they would pull her out and burn her at the stake.
It's just horrific.
They murdered hundreds of thousands of people, deeply convinced they were performing a moral good.
It is a catastrophic failure of morality, masquerading as righteousness. And we really have to recognize that the link between mental illness and supernatural evil isn't just ancient history.
No, it's not.
The sources note that even today, in places like northern Ghana, there are active witch camps where marginalized, often elderly women exhibiting signs of dementia or mental illness are exiled. When science is absent, fear just becomes policy.
But eventually, the witch hunts in Europe lost their momentum. And society was left with a very practical, very cold question: what do we do with these people?
Right.
Because they stopped burning them, but they certainly didn't integrate them. They locked them away in asylums.
They took old leprosariums, since leprosy was declining, and just repurposed them. But these were not hospitals. They were holding pens.
The Priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem in London is the classic example here. Founded in 1243, the name eventually slurred into Bedlam, which literally entered our dictionary as a synonym for chaos.
Bedlam, right.
By the 18th century, Bedlam was actually selling tickets. Upper-class citizens would pay a penny to walk through the galleries and watch the patients who were chained to the walls just for entertainment.
Which perfectly illustrates our central theme today. The authority shifted from the church to the state, but the moral degradation remained exactly the same. They were treating human beings suffering from psychosis like animals in a menagerie.
Reformers like Philippe Pinel in France and Dorothea Dix in North America eventually pushed for moral treatment. Removing the chains, offering compassionate care.
Yeah, a huge step forward.
And you'd think that as we moved into the 20th century and modern medicine took the wheel, the cruelty would stop. But it didn't. It just put on a white lab coat.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where we have to look closely at the Montreal experiments, because it completely shatters the illusion that scientific authority is inherently moral.
Right. Dr. Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute in the 1950s. He wasn't some fringe doctor working in a basement. He was the president of the American Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and the World Psychiatric Association.
He was the peak of medical authority.
But his theories on quote-unquote beneficial brainwashing caught the attention of the CIA during the Cold War.
Because the CIA was funding the Culture Project, and they wanted to know if the human mind could essentially be wiped clean and reprogrammed like a magnetic tape.
And Cameron believed it could. His process was called depatterning. He took patients who came in for relatively routine issues like anxiety or postpartum depression.
Just everyday people seeking help.
Exactly. And he subjected them to medically induced comas for up to 3 months. He administered massive, unconsented doses of LSD. He gave them electroconvulsive therapy multiple times a day at voltages far beyond clinical norms.
It's hard to even listen to.
It gets worse. Then he used psychic driving, where he'd force them to listen to a looped recording of a subliminal, degrading message like, "You killed your mother," for hundreds of thousands of repetitions while they were chemically paralyzed.
The human cost was just total psychological annihilation. Patients emerged from the Allen Institute with their entire personal histories erased. Linda McDonald, one of his patients, lost the first 26 years of her life.
Unbelievable.
She had to be retaught how to use a toilet, how to read, who her children were, and neither the Canadian government nor the CIA ever offered a formal, meaningful apology. They just quietly settled lawsuits decades later.
It proves that just because something is called science or medicine doesn't mean it isn't an atrocity.
Absolutely.
But this also begs the question, right? How did psychiatry actually pivot away from just shocking the brain to understanding how it works? How did we establish the modern paradigms of somatogenesis and psychogenesis?
Well, the breakthrough for somatogenesis, the physical origin of mental illness, actually came from, of all things, a sexually transmitted disease.
Which is wild.
Right. For years, doctors had observed this terrifying syndrome they called general paresis. Patients would suffer a steady deterioration of physical and mental abilities, massive delusions of grandeur, and eventual paralysis. It was completely untreatable.
But then Louis Pasteur proves the germ theory of disease. And in 1905, scientists finally identified the specific microorganism that causes syphilis.
Yeah.
And they realized that the late stages of a syphilis infection physically destroy brain tissue, causing general paresis.
The philosophical impact of this just cannot be overstated. For centuries, the mind and the body were treated as totally separate domains. The church handled the soul, doctors handled the body.
Right.
But syphilis proved that a microscopic physical invader could completely dismantle human sanity. It proved that the mind is fundamentally vulnerable to biology.
Which led Emil Kraepelin to create a biological classification system for mental illnesses, grouping syndromes together based on physical symptoms, which is the direct ancestor of the DSM we use today. But while Kraepelin was doubling down on biology, a completely different paradigm was forming. Psychogenesis, the idea that mental illness stems from the mind itself.
And its origins are incredibly theatrical, starting with Franz Anton Mesmer in the late 18th century. Mesmer treated hysterical disorders patients who experienced sudden blindness or paralysis with absolutely no physical cause.
He believed it was an imbalance of, quote, universal magnetic fluid.
Right, the magnets.
He would literally have patients sit around a vat of chemicals and touch them with iron rods to recalibrate their magnetism. It's totally absurd, and he was driven out of town as a fraud. But here's the wild part. His patients were actually getting better.
because without realizing it, Mesmer was utilizing an early theatrical form of hypnosis. It wasn't the magnets curing the patients, it was the power of suggestion.
Oh.
Later, Jean-Martin Charcot, a highly respected neurologist, proved you could both induce and remove hysterical symptoms in completely healthy people using hypnosis.
This shifts the entire focus away from brain tissue and onto human psychology. Which leads us to Joseph Breuer and his famous patient, Anna O.
A classic case study.
She had severe hysterical symptoms. Breuer starts hypnotizing her, and while she's under, she starts talking with extreme emotion about deeply repressed traumatic memories. When she woke up, her symptoms vanished. This was the birth of the cathartic method.
Reliving an emotional catastrophe and releasing the kinetic tension caused by suppressed thoughts.
Right, I always think of it like a soda bottle, or actually a seismic fault line is better.
Okay, a fault line.
Yeah, when a person experiences severe trauma, immense psychological pressure builds up along that fault line. If you don't allow small, controlled tremors to happen by talking through it, processing the emotion, letting the energy dissipate, the tectonic plates lock up.
And then the pressure just builds and builds.
Exactly. The pressure becomes unbearable until they finally snap into a catastrophic earthquake, which manifests as hysterical physical symptoms. The cathartic method was about releasing the pressure on the fault line.
That is a brilliant analogy. So we've traced the evolution from demonic possession to asylums through the horrific misuses of medical authority, all the way to the biological and psychological paradigm.
You've covered a lot.
We have. But that brings us directly to our sources on the current reality.
Yeah.
How is the mental health system in Canada actually functioning right now?
Well, if we look at the data, the system is buckling. A 2012 survey showed that roughly 1 in 10 Canadians reported symptoms consistent with a major mental or substance use disorder in the past 12 months.
Wow. 1 in 10.
We're talking about nearly 3 million people, but accessing care is a nightmare. By 2015, the national median wait time to see a psychiatrist after a referral was nearly 20 weeks. 5 months.
And this backlog is a direct consequence of a massive systemic policy failure called deinstitutionalization.
Yeah.
Starting in the 1960s, the government decided to shut down the massive, overcrowded psychiatric hospitals. The stated goal was humane, get people out of these archaic institutions and integrate them into community-based care.
But they didn't fund the community care.
No, they did not.
They closed the buildings to save money, but the patients didn't just disappear. Deinstitutionalization became transinstitutionalization. We didn't cure anyone, we just shuffled them around.
Right.
We moved them into the psychiatric units of general hospitals, which are essentially revolving doors because they need the beds. Or, much worse, we moved them onto the streets and into the prison system.
The statistics on the prison pipeline are just devastating. A 2010 report looking at the U.S. system found there were 300% more patients with serious mental illness incarcerated in jails than in actual hospital.
It's failing them. In Canada, the sources highlight the tragic case of Ashley Smith. She was a teenager with severe mental health issues. In 2007, she strangled herself in an Ontario prison after being transferred between 17 different correctional facilities and treatment centers in a single year.
17 facilities.
Yeah. She needed a therapeutic intervention, and the state just threw her into solitary confinement.
And this systemic neglect is fueled by profound public stigma. The media plays a massive role here. When a violent, isolated tragedy occurs, it dominates the news cycle, which distorts public perception.
The Vince Lai case in 2008 is the textbook example. He brutally killed a young man named Tim McLean on a Greyhound bus in Manitoba.
Right, a horrific tragedy.
Lai was suffering from untreated, severe schizophrenia. He was experiencing auditory hallucinations commanding him to act. He was found not criminally responsible. But events like that convinced the general public that severe mental illness just equals extreme violence.
Even though the statistical reality proves the exact opposite. The vast majority of individuals with mental illness are entirely nonviolent. In fact, they are significantly more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators.
Exactly.
But the stigma is so pervasive that the Center for Addiction and Mental Health reports it's the primary reason why only 1/3 of Canadians suffering from depression ever seek help. They are terrified of the label.
Which brings us back to our central question of morality. The Romano Report, which was a major royal commission on the future of healthcare in Canada, explicitly referred to mental health care as the orphan child of Medicare.
The orphan child, yeah.
The report asks a pretty damning question. If our modern society allows a teenager to wait a year for eating disorder treatment, or allows someone with schizophrenia to freeze on the streets, or relies on the penal system to manage psychiatric crises, is that not just a modern, sterilized version of the neglect we saw in the Dark Ages?
The Kirby Report echoed those exact sentiments, which did finally lead to the creation of the Mental Health Commission of Canada to attempt a coordinated national strategy. And the bright spot in the current literature is the shift toward community psychology.
Right, moving from the waiting mode to the seeking mode. Instead of a clinician sitting in an office waiting for a crisis to arrive at their door, community psychologists focus on prevention.
Getting ahead of it.
Yeah, they look at systemic interventions, putting early support programs in schools, establishing crisis hotlines, attacking the root causes before the fault line snaps.
Because reacting to a psychological collapse is exponentially harder than preventing the pressure from building in the first place.
We have covered incredible ground today, from ancient cultures drilling holes in skulls to pasture proving a physical germ can shatter the mind,
Right.
from the horrific hubris of Dr. Cameron's depatterning to the modern-day tragedy of trans-institutionalization. The way a society defines, treats, and funds abnormal psychology tells you exactly what that society values.
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to consider as you digest this chapter. We've spent this entire time looking at how history defines what is quote-unquote wrong with an individual's brain. But modern epidemiological data shows that poverty, low socioeconomic status, and early childhood trauma are among the strongest predictors of mental illness. So, if trauma and poverty are reliably manufacturing mental illness, perhaps we need to stop exclusively asking what is psychologically abnormal about this individual, and start asking what is psychologically abnormal about the way our modern society is structured.
That is the question. Thank you for studying with us today. Keep unpacking the material, and more importantly, keep questioning the norm until our next session. See you next time on the Psychology Undergrad.